Good morning and welcome to this early morning explainer for the Stylo News Intelligence Update. Today is August 13th, 2026. In this morning's briefing, we're going to provide you with a calm, objective, and fact-based look at the primary security patterns and flashpoints currently unfolding across the African continent. Our goal here is simple: present the facts on the ground so you can clearly understand the structural realities driving these events without any bias. So let's look at the data.
Before we dive in, we want to briefly acknowledge the technology making this analysis possible. This update is powered by ProWave AI, the developer of the Stylo Intel Ops open source intelligence program. It's their advanced AI-driven systems that allow us to process vast amounts of regional data, delivering these precise, neutral intelligence updates directly to you.
Here is our agenda for today. We'll be looking at 6 key areas: Central Africa's security and health, insurgent networks in West Africa, North African transit corridors, militant resurgence in East Africa, open-source sentiment analysis, and finally, our near-term strategic outlook.
Section 1. Central Africa, Security and Health.
The bottom line for Central Africa right now is that the region remains structurally unstable. The Democratic Republic of Congo, or DRC, continues to act as the primary center of gravity for regional friction. Basically, the concentration of armed conflict in the eastern DRC is acting as a catalyst for both direct violence and indirect cross-border instability involving neighboring states.
Let's break down the primary threat actors in this theater. The Allied Democratic Forces, or ADF, is still the clearest transnational terrorist threat, and they're continuing to demonstrate lethal capability and cross-border reach. Meanwhile, the M23 is the most militarily consequential insurgent force, heavily driving the interstate tension we're tracking. We're also monitoring enduring proxy conflict catalysts, specifically the rebel proxy militias known as the FDLR and Red Tabara. Now, crucially, these security challenges are being compounded right now by a surging Ebola outbreak in the eastern DRC. Recent reports indicate that roughly 200 riverboat passengers were recently isolated, and frontline health workers are actually threatening strikes over unpaid salaries. This health crisis is severely degrading local governments, it's straining infrastructure, and it's increasing the potential for localized unrest, which ultimately limits the mobility of security forces.
When we assess state stability across the Great Lakes, a really stark contrast emerges. The DRC and Burundi are assessed as unstable or conditionally unstable. They're facing a high risk of internal fragmentation and external proxy escalation. On the flip side, Rwanda and Uganda maintain strong internal state control and regime stability. However, they are heavily pressured from the outside. For instance, Uganda faces latent threats of militant infiltration on its western border. Rwanda, on the other hand, is dealing with recurring diplomatic friction and proxy war accusations tied to the M23 and Red Tabara conflicts. Right now, decision-makers in Kinshasa and Kigali are essentially deadlocked. Each side views the other's border policies as a direct existential threat, making diplomatic de-escalation quite difficult and keeping the risk of miscalculation high.
Moving on to Section 2. West Africa, Insurgent Networks.
The core assessment for West Africa is that the central Sahel states remain highly unstable. Insurgent groups are continuing to expand their territorial influence and freedom of maneuver, and this is happening despite ongoing military countermeasures. The dominant trend we're seeing is that while tactical military strikes are occurring, they just aren't reversing the underlying loss of governance in rural and contested areas.
The dominant insurgent network in the region is still JNIM, an al-Qaeda affiliate. This is particularly true in Mali, where they recently seized a fortified army base in the Sego region. Over in the Lake Chad Basin, remnants of the Islamic State West Africa Province, or ISWAP, and Boko Haram remain the core actors. We're also tracking expanding Islamic State-linked activity in southwestern Niger. This was highlighted by a recent attack in the Dosso region that tragically resulted in the deaths of 21 Nigerian soldiers. Now, complicating all these security challenges is some rising diplomatic friction. The Alliance of Sahel States, or AES, comprising Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, have publicly rejected recent remarks from Nigeria's leadership regarding the spread of terrorism. The AES leadership views ECOWAS and Nigerian policies as misaligned with their actual security realities, preferring self-reliant military governance over traditional regional blocs. This growing rift is a serious issue, as it threatens to further hinder already limited regional intelligence sharing and border coordination. Looking specifically at Nigeria, our intelligence estimate assesses the nation as institutionally resilient and formally stable at the national level. For example, a recent state-coordinated rescue of over 300 kidnapping victims really demonstrates their functional capacity. However, operationally, the state remains insecure in several northern and central zones, burdened by a complex mix of terrorism, banditry, and kidnapping. And, as we just mentioned, Nigeria's deteriorating diplomatic narrative with the AES states creates strategic blind spots, which insurgent networks are well positioned to exploit.
Section 3. North Africa. Transit corridors.
Our core assessment for North Africa is quite a bit different from what we're seeing in the Sahel or the Great Lakes. Right now, North Africa is characterized less by spectacular, high-visibility attacks and more by latent network persistence. Basically, it's functioning primarily as a vast facilitation zone.
Specifically, fractured governance and security gaps make Libya a highly permissive transit environment. Smuggling and facilitation networks are utilizing these corridors to move personnel, weapons, and illicit funds southward. Think of this logistical pipeline as a vital artery. It's sustaining the operations of ISIS remnants, al-Qaeda-linked JNIM factions, and other armed elements active in the Sahel. The instability we see in western Libya is directly fueling the violence we observe in West Africa.
Section 4. East Africa. Resurgence.
Over the last reporting period, we've tracked renewed insurgent pressure from al-Shabaab in East Africa. The facts on the ground indicate an increase in attacks on barracks and resumed bombings in the approaches to Mogadishu and the lower Shabelle corridors. Notably, this resurgence is applying direct pressure on both local forces and the African Union Stabilization Forces operating under the AWSOM mandate.
Section 5. OSINT and Sentiment.
Our AI-driven collection sweep relies on a comprehensive array of specific, objective sources. We're monitoring targeted social media hashtags to gauge local civilian reporting, and we're aggregating data from verified regional media and intelligence accounts. We're also utilizing satellite imagery across key logistical routes, like the Goma-Ruchucher axis and the Kasindi border crossing, and this allows us to objectively verify troop movements, displacement patterns, and border activity.
From this extensive data collection, a very clear picture of prevailing social sentiment emerges. Across the board, we're detecting widespread public anxiety about the failure of diplomatic coordination to contain these spreading crises. There's significant concern over conflict spillover in West Africa moving southward toward coastal states. We're tracking high dissatisfaction with that fractured relationship between ECOWAS and the Alliance of Sahel states. Plus, in Central Africa, there's acute anxiety regarding the compounding effect of the Ebola outbreak on an already fragile security environment. This broad public consensus suggests that reestablishing localized cross-border communication channels should really be a primary course of action for regional decision-makers to mitigate civilian harm.
Finally, Section 6. Near-term outlook. Maintaining our neutral, analytical perspective, here are the 3 most likely near-term events that we advise listeners to watch for. First, expect localized unrest and mobility constraints for both civilian and security forces in the eastern DRC as the Ebola outbreak continues to strain resources. Second, closely monitor the Burundi-Rwanda border. The escalating rhetorical accusations regarding Red Tabara and FDLR proxies run a high risk of triggering a tangible cross-border incident. And third, keep an eye on that diplomatic rift between Nigeria and the EAS states. Reduced border cooperation will inevitably create physical security gaps that insurgent networks are going to exploit. That leaves us with a critical, objective question to consider as these events continue to unfold. Will the ongoing breakdown of regional diplomatic arrangements, from the Great Lakes peace tracks to West African security pacts, lead to a wider contagion of instability? Or can localized military containment strategies hold the line? The data in the coming weeks will tell the story. Thank you for joining us for this early morning briefing. To explore these flashpoints in far greater depth and to hear our full analysis of the last 2 weeks of events across these regions, we invite you to listen to the full Stylo News Intel Update podcast on your favorite channel. You can also follow the link on this post or subscribe for AI-powered news on demand by visiting www.stylonews.com. I'm your host, bringing you the facts and wishing you a clear and informed day.